Well, again, good morning. And it is my pleasure to introduce our speaker this morning, who has written a most critical book at an essential time, How to Disagree, and how to do that better. Whether we realize it or not, disagreements touch nearly every aspect of our lives, from the intimate spaces of our homes to public arenas of our workplaces and politics. You might be interested to know that in personal relationships, a study of the American Psychological Association found that 75% of families experience recurring conflicts, often due to breakdowns in communication. Even in marriage, 69% of conflicts are never resolved. But couples who learn to manage these disagreements rather than eliminate them experience higher relationship satisfaction. In professional life, the Charter Personnel and Development Institute reports that 85% of employees face workplace conflict, leading to massive losses in productivity. And in our public life, as we know, polarization is higher than ever, with 90% of people on both parties holding unfavorable views of the opposing party. However, there are still Americans that believe that common ground can be found across differences. Our speaker today is an expert in navigating these deep differences with grace and empathy. John Inazu is the Sally D. Danforth Distinguished Professor of Law and Religion at Washington University at St. Louis. His scholarship and teaching on the First Amendment freedoms of speech, assembly, and religion, and how these relate to the broader legal theory. His latest book, Learning to Disagree, The Surprising Path to Navigating Differences with Empathy and Respect, tackles this very difficult challenge we face in trying to disagree constructively. He's also the author of Liberty's Refuge, The Forgotten Freedom of Assembly, published by Yale University Press, and Confident Pluralism, Surviving and Thriving Through Difference, and the co-editor with Tim Keller of Uncommon Ground, Living Faithfully in a World of Difference. In addition to his academic work, John founded the Carver Project and the League of Vocational Fellowship, and he serves as a senior fellow at Interfaith America. His remarkable background includes a PhD from UNC Chapel Hill and a JD from Duke. We'll need to sort that one out, along with time spent as an associate general counsel for the Department of the Air Force. Please join me in welcoming John, who will provide us with some tools for the journey. So John, one of the things that occurs to me is that one of the things that we do as a church is really try to help people think about Christian identity and how being a Christian invites us to think differently about how we engage in this world. And that sometimes the things that we see in the public square actually mock God's and Jesus' own call and behavior. And we see this across the perspective in every dimension of life. No one individual, but many. And if we're honest, we can even engage that way too ourselves. I'd like you to speak to this question of Christian identity and in particular, how that sort of became alive in your own life. Did you grow up in a religious household?
Yeah, thanks. Thanks so much for having me here too. It's really great to be here, and I was really moved even how you opened this with the summary of how you all are engaging with Western North Carolina. I was on the phone yesterday with a close friend in Nashville who was, they were trapped in their house with trees on their cars and 3 kids and a tub full of water, and so this feels very real, and it's like you said, it's going to be years and years. So I'm grateful to churches like this that are doing practical sorts of things. I grew up as a military brat. Laura and I were talking before about that common background, and so we moved every 2 years, and there would be a new church somewhere near the base every 2 years, and we would go, and largely through my mom, I think, through Sunday school, through just the repeated exposure, came to faith, and then when I was in high school, the Ministry of Young Life was important to helping me connect on a more personal and deeper level. And so by the time I went to college at Duke, I went to college thinking, how can I grow in faith? How can I plug into Christian community? And found a church, Blacknall Presbyterian, near campus that was really just deeply formative for college, for law school, and then graduate school. And it was that church community, as I think I grew into adulthood and then eventually marriage and kids, that anchored my understanding of faith and discipleship and formation.
So when you think of Christ and the call to live a Christian life, how is that different from sort of living and getting caught up in behaviors that don't necessarily reflect the love of Christ?
You know, a couple of things come to mind. One, I think my favorite verse in all of Scripture is Paul in 1 Corinthians saying, if it's just for this life that we have hope, then just pity us, because what are we doing? If the resurrection isn't real, then none of this matters. And so part of being a Christian is holding on to a hope that is more than just the immediate suffering or sadness you see around you, the discouragement that might look on the horizon next year or in the next 5 years or tomorrow, and knowing that there's a longer story. And then I think related to that is just a sense of letting go of fear and anxiety, because ultimately we're not in control and we don't need to be in control. So I think in Exodus, for example, of the promise of God to be faithful for thousands of generations. And what a mind-blowing idea that is, that if we're serious that God's story unfolds over thousands of generations, then we are all such bit players in that, and the pressure is kind of off, because there's a big God whose story is unfolding and who has told us how the story ends. And so the call to be faithful in the small blip in the radar that we represent is an opportunity rather than something to be fearful about.
Mm-hmm. I'm curious how you, at a university, someone who's, I assume, gets on social media every now and again, watches the news, how do you guard your soul? How do you, from getting caught up in the bitterness and the rage it's so easy to get into?
I love the way you phrased the question, because I do think it's kind of a guarding of the soul mentality. I think part of it is I feel very gifted with friendships and relationships in all directions, politically, religious, and otherwise. And so just to see how people engage in my own life, how people love me well coming from different perspectives, the reminder that it's a big world out there and that there is no sort of one group that has it locked in, and that lots of people are very generous and gracious with how they engage with me and others in the world. That's one piece of it. A very practical piece is, you mentioned sort of a spending Sabbath, but the actual Sabbath of just taking not just time off of work, but time offline. So trying to once a week take a 24-hour period where I'm not checking in on what's happening in the news, social media, email. And then the real gift that as a family we've developed, and this is hard to do in a lot of jobs, but I think my job is one where it's possible with enough advanced planning. We take an entire week off each summer where we're just completely off the grid, offline. Our kids are offline. We don't know anything that's happening in the world, and that week is just so restorative and soul inspiring in terms of how we can connect with each other, connect with God, to see the world becomes smaller in some very tangible ways. And it's not, I think we're still called to go back into the bigger world, but that break and that focus is really essential.
I think there's a real sense in which when we watch the news, when we see the behaviors that we see in so many dimensions of our country and around the world, it's so easy to think that if we can just get through the next cycle or this, that, or the other, that eventually things are going to kind of calm down. So I wonder, when you think of spiritual practices and being able to have a level of engagement and disengagement, how, particularly in your academic work, particularly on college campuses, what are the prayers that you say for your ongoing capacity to be in this world? and also to listen with an open heart and try to build relationships across difference.
So I think one sort of starting centering prayer is just to remind myself that I'm not in control, and that's okay. I mean, at a place like Washington University, which is a wonderful school, but not in any sense Christian, and it's not going to be a Christian school in our lifetimes, and that's okay to know that there's a lot of really good stuff happening at that school, and I can look for beauty and goodness in the cracks of what are often hard times and hard places. So to look to the prayer for kind of an openness to where God is working both inside and outside of the church formally. And then the other thing that comes to mind, and my friend Andy Crouch was talking about walking through an airport and how he was just telling himself as he's watching all the people coming by in the other direction, and he was just saying image bearer to every in his mind, to a short prayer for every person, knowing they're juggling 1,000 different things, but just to remind himself that every person in that airport. And so I try to do that sometimes. I'm walking across campus and I see this flood of students and staff and others coming, and if I can just say, I don't do this every day, but when I can say, oh, image bearer, and there's a story, and there is a burden, and there's a joy, and there's so much complexity to each person walking by, and what an opportunity that is to engage with people.
In your view, what are the primary factors that hold people back from engaging in healthy disagreement?
I think it depends on personality, so it's very hard to generalize this. I think there are some people who can't engage in healthy disagreement because they're too busy talking all the time. So they're very eager to share their own views. They're actually not curious people. Sometimes they even pretend to be curious. They'll say, "Tell me what you think," and then while you're still talking, they'll let you know what they think. And then there are other people who I think need to summon a little more courage to try to speak up more. Sometimes they think, well, my voice is not going to be welcomed here, or my perspective doesn't matter. And I think this is where Christianity provides such a great set of resources to remind us, no, it actually takes the whole body, the whole parts of the body coming together, that everybody's voice is valuable and should be heard. So at an individual level, it's trying to understand and discern what is my own reticence to engage, or what are my own blind spots, or what do I need to work on personally and interpersonally for better engagement. And then I think to answer that question, we probably need, first and foremost, friends around us who speak truth into our lives, because we're very bad at diagnosing this for ourselves.
So in that context, how do you stay true to your convictions while kind of remaining open to opposing viewpoints in difficult conversations? So it's a balancing act. It's sometimes hard.
It is a balancing act. I think part of it is choosing battles, that God doesn't need us to be his spokesperson for every single issue under the sun, and I can be informed and careful and helpful on a small subset of issues. Even within the law, most of the time when people ask me a legal question, my first answer is, well, go talk to a specialist, because that's not my area. But there's a small area of the law and maybe politics that I do know something about, and if I can stay in that lane and engage, then I can often do so in a way that is pretty clear about where I'm coming from, and then also curious about where others are coming from. And then when it comes to matters of faith, maintaining conviction, but also engagement, I think it's just a reminder of where our confidence ultimately lies. And it's less about certainty. It's less about, I'm not willing to budge on anything I believe, but it's a reminder of what confidence in the person and work of Jesus is, and how, back to the earlier point about the resurrection, this is the whole thing. And if we really believe this, if we really believe that all of the created order is being restored by this loving God who has us in his hands, then of all people, we should be the ones who should say, come with your questions and your doubts and your critiques and your arguments, because this is ultimately not about us and our own wisdom.
What about the cost of winning? It seems like when we get into arguments, we want to win. There's a kind of price to certainty. And I wonder about the we can all think about what the upside to winning is, right? But What's the cost of winning at all costs?
Well, in that version of the question, where you just named it, right? That if we sacrifice our values and our principles to win, then it's a very hollow victory. But I think there's another cost of winning, which is when we win, when we gain power, when we think we have the upper hand, it's very easy to persuade ourselves that the right answers follow from that initial victory. And it's very easy to start to think, well, we are clearly the ones who have the answers and the solutions, and it's easy to stop listening. Mm-hmm. So I think maybe a healthier way for Christians to think about even winning in a worldly sense is that those should be held very loosely. They're contingent and time-limited victories, and maybe you're supposed to steward a set of relationships or an area of responsibility for a very brief time, but to keep listening and then to hold it loosely so that you can hand that right back over sooner rather than later.
I often hear in public discourse, the fact of the matter is, it's a pet peeve of mine, the fact of the matter is. But the age-old question of what is truth mm-hmm. is maybe not as simple as we want it to be. And I was struck by a sort of an image where someone was invited into this image to envision 3 or 4 people who go into the ocean, and they are asked to describe the ocean. And it's the ocean, right? And so it should be pretty clear. But one person says it's wavy. Another person says it's salty. Another person says, it's cold. How do you think of truth that can often be binary in our understanding, and truth that also can be pluriform in nature, that reflects a wider range? And how do we develop hearts to see the fullness of truth, rather than often have times when the anxiety is going hard to move into the black and white thinking?
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. I think it's helpful maybe to pause and almost distinguish analytically between different claims to truth. So there are just clear facts of the world. Today is Sunday, and there'll be some people who are now going to disagree with those facts of the world. And just as a political matter, it's essential to keep that kind of disagreement or rejection of facts of the world as minimal as possible, because we need to agree on basic facts to live together in society. And then there are claims to truth. Jesus rose from the dead is a claim of truth. It's also not provable in the sense of the same way today is Sunday. So we can hold truth claims confidently, and we live toward them and into them because we're compelled by their grasp on our lives, but we don't explain them in the same way as today is Sunday. And then there's a whole lot of life. This is a little bit to the ocean metaphor, where especially with human relationships, there are complex stories and events and fractures that are capable of being described accurately in many different forms. So when human beings clash, whether it's over a policy issue or even an interpersonal issue, was it murder or self-defense? Was it sexual assault or consensual? And we can frame these kinds of questions from many different perspectives, and you might actually not be at a point where there is truth and falsity to those claims, but there's actually just a complex set of human relationships that are going to be resolved by some combination of evidence and judgment and perspective, and sometimes that judgment and perspective gets it wrong. And so I think without surrendering the importance of truth, we can also have a kind of humility in policy matters, in human interactions, to say we might not have the full picture, and in fact, as part of the reality of sin and tragedy in the world, we might not never know the full picture, and we do our best to, with integrity and with love, to explain descriptively and accurately what we encounter, but also with some humility know that we're not going to have the full picture.
I think you've answered the question, but is it possible for 2 opposing views to both be true?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I spent a year I worked at the Pentagon for 4 years and spent a year investigating sexual assault at the service academies. And just part of that investigation was going through dozens and dozens of fact patterns and allegations and criminal offenses. And one of the heartbreaking realities of some, but not all, some of those cases were very clearly crimes or not crimes, but there was a handful in the middle where you read the witness statements and you tried your best as a lawyer and a team to figure out what was going on here, and you walked away thinking, I think she thought this and I think he thought that, and neither one of them is lying or confused, but because of the complexity of that particular encounter, they saw two things quite differently with enormous stakes and tragic consequences. And that might be an extreme example, but I think we experience this in more mundane ways in just our ordinary interactions. We'll have this happens with my wife all the time, where we'll have an argument, or there's something about the tone in which someone said a comment, and we're both very clear about how the tone was conveyed, and maybe we're both right, but we heard it differently. And
let's talk about empathy. Empathy seems like an old-fashioned emotion or value. How do you define empathy?
I think of it as, and I should back up and say, with this book, one of the cases I'm trying to make is that while many of you might think that lawyers are part of the problem, I'm suggesting, I hope there's some lawyers in here, I'm suggesting that we are part of the solution. Figured I would be on safe grounds at this church. That the one of the skills that law trains you to do well is a kind of work of empathy, so that you understand the other side or the other perspective as charitably as possible. You can make their arguments in a way that are sensible to them, not just your own perspective of the argument. And part of that work, this gets to the definitional point, is then trying as much as you can to step into the shoes of that other person or that other perspective. Now, I think this is importantly and immediately qualified with the reality that we will not ever fully step into anyone else's shoes, because we're complex, unique human beings, especially when you add different identities and experiences and value sets, but we can still do the work as much as possible to get over there and to imagine and be creative, and then to be charitable in how we're envisioning that other person's struggles or arguments or beliefs or experiences.
Mm-hmm. So as we kind of begin to shift toward skills differences, it doesn't seem to me that you're saying in your book, everybody just needs to calm down, because clearly in life, in politics, or just in every realm, as I said from the beginning, at home, at work, in the public square, there are people that feel they have a lot at stake. And so if you were to sit down with two groups of people that are really upset and are engaging in a kind of warism, which seems to be the kind of order of the day, how would you mediate that?
I'm thinking of both the theoretical and the practical to answer that question. Let me start with the theoretical. Assuming that, well, first I would try as much as possible to build a little bit of trust, because I think trust is the predicate for all of this. If you're entering any kind of conversation, whether professionally in this example or interpersonally, and there's not trust, it's very unlikely that there's going to be successful communication. But assuming a kind of trust, on the theoretical level, I would start by saying these differences are massively important, and these questions of policy and politics and everything else, they matter tremendously to all kinds of questions of human flourishing, of the good of our society, and those sorts of things. And for some of these, there are right and wrong answers. And yet, this political process and the system of laws that we have is how we as a society have chosen to resolve otherwise intractable differences. And it's a much better alternative to street violence. And so we have to commit to this system. And we can see in other parts of the world today where the alternative is extremely ugly and it's extremely harmful, and the people who are most quickly affected when political society breaks down are the most vulnerable. So if as Christians, if we start with the premise that we care about the least of these, those who are most in need of protection from injustice, then we'd better double down on the systems that help preserve those protections, however imperfect and however unjust they may themselves be. They're far better to the alternative. So trying to recommit in both of those hypothetical groups to what the system is and why we need to care about it. And then the next step, and this is more practical, because I think you've posited groups that are ideologically homogenous and maybe sold on their own premises. I think we've got an enormous problem right now with information flow and news sources and communication. And part of this, it's not going to get any better. All of the incentives for media right now are against careful journalism. The news organizations are firing their editors. There's far less care happening, even at the very top places. The structure and support and checks are in trouble, and they're not getting better because we, the consumers, are signaling that that's not what we want, and I don't see how this is solvable. So in place of really good, trusted, careful news that can convince a broad swath of the population of its trustworthiness, I think it's essential for us as individual consumers of the news to diversify our feeds, to try to understand what's happening from lots of different perspectives. And that might mean, as a matter almost of personal responsibility, or in these two groups you're talking about, taking time away from our traditional news sources and figuring out what is happening over here, what am I not seeing, how am I not understanding how this is being covered, and to realize that if we don't do that, there's actually an act of formation that's happening. And really, frankly, for a lot of people, that formation is a lot more of our week than church on Sundays or Wednesday nights or whenever it is. Mm-hmm. And so if you come here and you're getting a couple hours of formation, but the rest of your formation in life is dozens of hours on social media or watching news, you're going to be formed by this stuff a lot more. And so to take, in these two groups, to take very practical, concrete, and sometimes maybe even radical steps to get out of some of those constant feeds.
Well, you certainly make the point that social media has made it so much more difficult to know what's really going on, what's true, to balance views. The polarization, the rage factor is, it's profitable, isn't it? But it certainly makes things a lot harder. I had a conversation summer before last with Eric Schmidt at Aspen Ideas Festival, who said that in this next election cycle, you're just not going to know what's really going on. We know with AI, with various memes, with the kinds of things, it's going to be really, really hard. And I said, well, what do you recommend? And he said, get your church together as much as possible to connect with each other, to talk about what's going on, and in the midst of the rage machine, try to find connection, peace, faith, well-being. These are the things that we're talking about.
I could not agree with that anymore. That's so essential. And I think actually even just a few weeks out from this election, I think we're largely underestimating how significant this is going to be. All the factors you mentioned, plus the algorithmic sorting that's going to put all of this on steroids. And it might last a couple of hours or it might last weeks. And if we're stuck in those social media chambers of election and post-election, realistically, we're talking post-election too, because we're not going to have clarity within a matter of hours of the polls closing. So what's the alternative if that's what's happening? Well, the alternative is the local embodied community of human beings who have worked to trust each other, who see an institution that they can come together and be part of, and then actually to come together graciously and with a kind of openness. And this goes back to the point we were just talking about. If you come into that having vented for 20 hours watching your preferred news source, it's going to be very hard to come in with an open heart. And so I think this is, at a very practical level, the next few weeks and beyond are going to be an example of Christian discipleship? And can we come together? I mean, for those of you who are members here and you've taken membership vows to this community, can you come together in this community to pursue truth together? And I don't think neither side is going to be giving you truth in the days after the polls close.
So coming together to pray, coming together to share meals, coming together to engage in hurricane relief. I mean, these could be some of the healthiest things that we can do.
I think that's right. And you don't want, in terms of finding common ground and shared purpose, you don't want to rely completely on natural disasters in the Olympics, right? Because you want those to be at but there's also something very practical about the reality of what people need right now, and realizing that what you can do as an institution is enormously important. And it's not, you can do things, thinking right now of Western North Carolina, that would not be possible just by individuals. And this is, I think, collectively we're seeing a massive lessening of trust and belief in institutions, especially with younger generations. And this is an opportunity to model. Institutions are messy, they're hard to lead, they're hard to sustain, and they're just essential because institutions at scale can help engage in a broken and hurting world. And this, we are now seeing one very tangible example of this, but that's true in the rest of our lives as well. That's true, next year and 10 years from now in Charlotte and in the communities around you. And that's going to take a kind of trust building and collective witness that's not possible unless you're engaged.
Well, what is, I want to ask you the question about engaged activism in a little bit, but you mentioned kids, and I could ask the question of how do we talk to kids about what's going on, but I want to explore a deeper question, which goes to really sort of the point of the book, which is what are the values and skills, because I do think these are skills that we need to be thinking about inculcating in our young people and in our own lives, because boy, we can get our fingers trapped on the scroll and scrolling the screen ourselves. So, what is that? What does that look like? If you were to raise kids in this world right now, which doesn't seem to be getting any nicer, right? We're not going to be going back to the time when you and I grew up, where we had a couple of channels and maybe we were exposed to the news maybe twice a day. We had an evening newspaper and a morning newspaper. It sounds very nostalgic. Mm-hmm. But again, the call of the church is to rise to the occasion. And so think with us about that. What are the skills? And say something about also forgiveness. It seems like no one forgives anymore. No one apologizes. It's that's kind of strident win at all cost approach.
Yeah, so let me start with the skills and practices. And here I'll point out that the title of the book is Learning to Disagree. The word learning with some deliberation, meaning something that we work on and are never finished doing. So even beyond kids, we're going to be learning for the rest of our lives, which means we're going to screw up, we're going to make mistakes. That takes us to forgiveness, which I'll mention in a moment. But more generally, I think we have to practice this. We have to work toward inculcating habits, and habits only come with practicing with other human beings. So what are the habits of engagement or the postures of engagement? I think things like listening and curiosity, things like having a humility about our own abilities to persuade, and recognizing that even if we are fully convinced of something, we might not be able to explain to someone else why we think we're right and they're wrong, because they might just be coming from a completely different set of experiences. And if we can prioritize the relationship and the human being across from us before trying to win the argument, that's an important part of engagement, even a foregrounding of mutual respect. I think there was a way, when we were growing up, there was a form of evangelism or apologetics in Christian circles that was presupposing if I can just get the right argument, if I can just get out my 4 propositions, then surely I will convince you to the rightness of Christian faith. And what that does is there are a number of problems with that, but one of them is that it instrumentalizes that other person. You're my project. You are the person who I'm going to, the notch on my belt, as opposed to you're an image bearer and you have dignity and worth, and I probably have something to learn from you. And if I'm gonna, before I preach to you, am I willing to listen to you about your own perspectives? Am I willing to take your questions and your doubts? And I think that's a much better recipe for not just engaging across difference, but really anytime we want to share what we believe or our lives or our convictions with anyone else in the world. And then to know that sometimes that's not going to be well received, and sometimes there'll be tension and trauma and harm that in one direction or the other requires a kind of forgiveness to move past it. And here I think Christians have such an opportunity to model well forgiveness in the world, both receiving forgiveness, and that means knowing that we're capable of being forgiven, and extending forgiveness, knowing that we ourselves are in need of forgiveness. And I think what we have in the Gospels and in the witness of the church are these powerful models and exemplars of, faced with deep injustice and deep harm, people still being able and willing to forgive. And there's a growing sense, I think, in a lot of our culture today where some people just want to move beyond that, right? That thinking forgiveness is either too costly or too cheap or whatever it is, but people thinking we don't need that in society. And I think the counterpoint, Desmond Tutu's book, No Future Without Forgiveness, that's a political claim. There is no shared future without a collective sense of forgiveness that manifests by lots of individual acts of forgiveness. And forgiveness is costly, and there's no way to do that unless you're anchored, I think, in a larger story that says, despite absorbing this pain or this injustice, there is a way for me to continue to engage and to free you and to free me from what would otherwise define us for the rest of our lives.
Is it still possible for us to love our enemies?
Well, it better be, because that's the command, right? Yeah, I think...
and how do you do that?
Well, I think one of the growing concerns I have is that when it comes to enemies or even opponents, political or otherwise, we have moved from thinking you're wrong to you're evil. And once we cross that line, it's very hard to figure out how you walk that back. And when you think that someone's wrong, even deeply wrong, they have the wrong policies, they're voting for the wrong person, their wrong views are going to lead to lots of harm and sadness in society, you can still try to persuade them. You can still go to lunch with them. You can still go to church with them. You can still find common ground. If you really believe that person's evil, it's very hard to know how to engage in a common set of relationships with them. Because with evil, you want to minimize, mitigate, and root out evil. And there is evil in the world, and we do need to name the reality of evil. I think as Christians, it's essential to recognize evil. Not that evil wins or holds priority, but that it's there in the here and now. So
not the kind of Augustinian, the absence of good, but a pervasive force that's seeking to destroy the world.
Well, or at least the in our lives. I mean, I think ultimately I like the Augustinian view that evil is not finally reality, but it's a reality of our shared existence now, and to know that. But then at the same time, I mean, this is a very hard thing for Christians to do. How do you both name that and then say, and every single person is an image bearer? Not most people, but every single person. And how do we start with the image bearer claim to reality of the people with whom we engage? And then how do we, as much as possible, separate people from the ideas they hold? And we still need to be able to say that idea is not just wrong, but it's very harmful, or I really hope that you and your people lose in the polls, because we can't have that for our country. And at the same time, you're my image bearer across from me. You're my enemy whom I love. Maybe you're my friend in the making even. And to hold out that possibility and not to let relationships be defined by characterizing the other person as evil.
Many say this is the worst situation, condition that our nation's ever faced. I think maybe you hold a different view.
Yeah, I don't think that's right. And I think it's actually quite important to situate ourselves in historical reality. You know, a lot of people will say, well, there was the Civil War. Yes, there was the Civil War. And there was also massive labor and class unrest in the 1920s. And there was a bomb a day going off in the 1960s. And we can actually, in the 1940s, my family as Japanese Americans were incarcerated during the war, and Jim Crow. So we have had all kinds of deep polarization and deep hurt and deep fracture and tension in this country. And today, I think we feel this because we're in it. So it's very natural to feel like this is as intense as it's ever been. It's not. It could get bad, and I think we, as responsible citizens and Christians, need to be very aware of the possibility of things getting worse and doing what we can to stop them, but also to name the reality of where things have been. And then I think also to look back and say, and it's pretty remarkable that we as a country have persevered through some of these tension spots. I mean, even from the founding, when people look back and say, well, who was in power then? It was the white Protestant male landowners. How hard was it for them to get along? Well, incredibly hard. Around the world, they were killing each other over their religious beliefs. And then here in this country with this experiment, we proved that there was a better way of doing it where you didn't have to kill each other. And I think we can both look back and say, those were some remarkable political possibilities that no one foresaw. And at the same time, we've really screwed it up also. And there are voices that we marginalized, there were people that we hurt, and we continue to do that today. So that I think Christians are called to describing the world truthfully, and part of truthful description is to name the messiness and the good and the bad together.
I don't mean to be glib with this question, but how do we get through Thanksgiving?
Yeah, it's not a glib. Yeah, it's a great question. So, I mean, this is really true.
This is as practical as it gets right here. This is a take-home.
Yes.
There's a take-home in here somewhere.
Yes, that's right.
Okay.
Focus on football and turkey and memories. I mean, really. So I think Thanksgiving is always so high pressure. Like, set aside politics, Thanksgiving is high pressure because there are lots of things going on, right? And there are lots of people coming together. And I think today a lot of people will say, well, I feel like I don't even know this person anymore. And the reason for that is you don't even know this person anymore, because you might have grown up with a whole set of shared memories and values and experiences, and those can sustain you for a long time. And they do actually anchor you to a collective story that is important to remember. But if the last few years have been lived quite differently with different influences and media sources and experiences, it's very hard to, especially during the pressures of a holiday and food and all of this, and people weary from travel. And I remember with little kids, I remember going back to see my parents, and we would drive 15 hours to get to them, and we'd just be exhausted after this van ride with these little kids. And the last thing we were ready to do was engage in a hard conversation. So to remember that probably if you feel like you don't know each other, step one is to get reacquainted, not have a hard discussion. And if someone tries to have the hard discussion or pokes and prods, just to go in with enough prayer and centering and understanding to say, I'm just going to let that one ride. And if I really care enough about this relationship, we'll revisit it over a non-holiday. We'll pick a time to come together and talk about this, but don't do it at Thanksgiving. Just focus on the people around you. And I think if if these relationships are important, you should and will find the time to work on the hard issues. You don't have to do that at the end of November.
As we wrap up today, we've talked a little bit about this, but again, I want to get real practical here. What do you think are some of the most important things that we as Christians and religious communities can do pre-election, post-election, that can stabilize us, keep us connected to each other, and keep us focused on the needs of our world? What would be the challenges you could give us, both how we live at home, our workplace, and in the public square?
I think, in the public square, I think to remind each other that we have to be modest in our claims and modest in our goals, that politics is essentially about compromise, and it's messy and it's contingent. And if we're going to engage in that world, we need to recognize it for its strengths and its weaknesses. In the very practical sense of who you are as a church and a community, and I don't know precisely what your membership vows are, but I probably have a sense of what they're close to.
One of them is to respect the dignity of every human being.
So that's a good start. Yep. And then there's probably something about your commitment to each other as a community.
Yes.
So I would actually literally go over your membership vows to this church and to one another sometime between now and the election and say, what did this mean to take this vow? I get to say these things and then leave, and then you have to do the hard work.
No. Will you do all in your power to support each other and their life in Christ? Will you respect the dignity of every human being? That's a little bit.
That's a good start.
Yeah.
Yep.
Yes.
And then to remind each other, not in a judgy, sanctimonious way, but when it gets hard and when you start to feel like you're not actually doing that, or more likely the person next to you is not doing that, how do you figure out how to call each other back to the common purpose of serving Christ, loving God, loving neighbor, being part of this particular embodied community? And what that means is you're, at least for purposes of being, showing up here and being together, you're setting aside some of the other things that might otherwise divide you and saying, this is our principal collective identity. And it matters. It matters to who we are together, and it also matters to a watching world.
That's a good thing to be reminded of. We are one in Christ, though very different in our views, different in how we're feeling about the state of the world, different in what we hope for, but nevertheless built by a common call to love one another and to work together to find common ground and, when possible, for the common good. That is our Christian identity. And as one of your mentors, Stanley Hauerwas, said, our citizenship is in heaven. So that's a good thing to remember, that before we are anything else, before we are of a particular family, particular community, particular religious or particular political view, we are called by Christ himself to engage in a world that is both active and confronts the powers and principalities of this world, but never seeks ultimate destruction, but seeks to build. And if I can challenge you all today, is to pray as much as you can, to limit your exposure to social media, to go outside and connect with people and realize that there's a lot of goodness in this world. And you will find that we're going to have more capacity to do what needs to be done and to live at peace in our world if we do those things. Will you close us in prayer, sir?
Sure. Let's pray. Lord, thanks so much for the privilege of being with this community of people, these witnesses, the image bearers here who care about the image bearers around them.